17 of the most inspiring words of the 20th century, of American 20th century, came on the day John F. Kennedy was prayed in as the President of the United States, January 20th, 1961. It was at the end of his inaugural address. He was concluding his remarks, and he had just declared that the torch had been passed down to a new generation of Americans. He said, born in this country, Americans that were, quote, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage. And those Americans pledged, quote, to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. And at the end of that address, President Kennedy began to lead into these 17 words that have gone down in history when he said, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy's point was this: the country can't resource people, but people, they've got to resource their country. And those words, they were electrifying to those present, and they're still electrifying today, and here we are begging a new generation of Americans to grab a hold of that. No president had ever challenged its citizens, especially in peacetime, to sacrifice or to commit to such an enormous vision. And with that single sentence, Kennedy inspired a generation, his generation, to new possibilities, and he raised their expectations of themselves and of their country. You know, we hear words like that, and we just want to run outside and begin to share it with the generation of America today. Makes us want to make a difference, right? But as encouraging as that statement is that Kennedy said, you know, there are a lot of people that think about God the same way. They think about the Christian life the way Kennedy would say with regard to our country. They wouldn't admit it if you asked them. But it's almost as if they think that somehow God is dependent on them. As though God and his cause in the world, it relies on us. And they live as though what really matters in life is what you and I are able to accomplish for him. You can almost hear Kennedy's words in the way they see life. Don't ask what your God can do for you. Ask what you can do for your God. And yet, in the passage we'll look at today, we're going to come face to face with Jesus. In a worldview like that, and watch as Jesus takes that attitude, that mindset, or this idea that life is about what you can do or the goals that you can achieve for God, more than anything else. And it'll turn that idea right on its head. And we'll discover that to Jesus, working for God, putting TVs up, or doing anything for the Lord, that's not what really matters most. It's not the most needful thing. It's not so much what I can accomplish for God that really matters in my life, or what I could do for him. What's most important is discovering what God can do for you. What's most needful is sitting at his feet and feasting on his word. Our text this morning is Luke 10. If you want to turn there, Luke chapter 10. I better do that too. Last time we met, the time before last, we were in Luke chapter 10. We were listening to a lawyer and a conversation he had with Jesus. You remember that. The lawyer stood up in the crowd and he asked the daunting question that's asked time and again. What can I do to inherit eternal life? And as the conversation moved and continued on, he asked Jesus to define a neighbor. And we saw through that message, through that story there, that a neighbor is anyone that we confront, anyone who is in need, whom God has put you in a position to meet. And in the very next verse, in Luke chapter 10, verse 38, Luke then moves the narrative away from this setting. We ended in verse 37 before we fast-forwarded last week into the Lord's Supper. You remember that, Luke 22. Now we're come back to Luke 10, and we're going to pick up right where we left off with the story of the compassionate Samaritan, that parable. He moves it away from the crowd, and Luke begins to describe a visit where you find Jesus and his disciples entering into the house of two women, sisters. And if you know the Gospel of John, then you know these sisters very well, Mary and Martha. Well, one of these sisters, during Jesus' visit, spends most of her time in the kitchen, preparing a banquet for Christ and his disciples, while her other sister sits at Jesus' feet, feasting on his word. We'll pick up reading in verse 38. Now it came to pass, as they went, that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. Martha, I picture her as the type of person who she's always volunteering to help. Martha was always the one making sure that everything was done just right. And if there was any one area where Martha was gifted, where she excelled, it was this gift of hospitality, right? She's the woman where you see in church one of the 20% of women doing 80% of the work, right? This here. I picture kind of like a Martha Stewart, She's got that stylish homemaking personality, kind of like Judy. If you ever seen her house, it's gorgeous and immaculate. She had the gift of warmth and kindness, and she used that gift to serve others. And one day, she heard Jesus was coming. Luke's phrasing here says that now as they were traveling along, Jesus and his disciples show up to the house, kind of with an unannounced visit. He doesn't tell us why Jesus came along or what led them. We don't know, but you can tell that it doesn't sound like they knew that they were going to be their guests that day, right? And as soon as she hears that Jesus is coming, her instincts take over. What an honor. She heard that they were coming, and she begins to think about nothing else and what she can do and what she might do to serve them. So much needed to be done before they were arriving. There was cleaning, buying, chopping, cooking, and baking. A lot of planning had to go in. Jesus was coming to their house. Can you imagine what you would do if Jesus was coming to your house? Man, wow. I have 4 children. Don't even think about washing up. What are we going to feed them? Not just Jesus. There's 12 disciples. A lot had to go into planning this visit. This was the Lord. This was Jesus of Nazareth. Martha spared nothing for the Lord. I can picture her putting place cards on the table, goat cheese in the salad, and wine at every place setting. This was going to be a feast like no other feasts, if Martha had anything to say about it. She is given the opportunity to serve the Son of God, and she wanted to shine all the love that she could on him. He deserved the very best she could give him, and what she could give him demanded nothing less. Everything had to be just right. And so as she welcomes him into the home, she offers him the best seat in the house. And verse 39 tells us that Martha, she had a sister called Mary. And from the moment she heard that Jesus was coming, Just one thought consumed Mary. Just one. It's all she could think about all day. I wonder how long he'll stay. Wow. Maybe he'll spend the night. Yeah? She probably could just thinking about him coming. What's the lesson going to be about? What will he teach on this time? Mary, it says here, she sat at Jesus' feet. She heard his word. And as Jesus spoke, you could just see Mary like a sponge, just soaking up everything he said. She wasn't standing up like the lawyer was to confront Jesus. No, Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, a place of submission, listening right at the front row. I could just picture her right in the front, the disciples around, Mary, ready to listen, ready to learn, ready to believe. Of course, Martha wasn't there. She couldn't hear the Bible study. She was too focused on serving. A meal had to be done. She'd become so concerned about all the things that could go wrong over the meal, she couldn't even hear what was going on in the other room. Just like we often do, we get so caught up in a project or something. Parents get caught up in either work, I don't know, maybe cleaning the house, or we're too distracted to pay attention to the kids. The boss gets so caught up in meeting his quota, he's not thinking of the employees anymore. Kids get so distracted as they grow up and raise their own family, they don't have time to call mom and dad. Distractions, you get so busy and so caught up in the thick of things that you forget some of the most important things, what's right in front of you. And as the meal preparation goes on, you can just see her distractions slowly devolving into almost a self-pity. I suspect the meal probably wasn't going very well. I mean, Martha had to prepare it alone, right? No one was there to help her. I can picture the stove giving off more smoke than heat, right? The bread refused to rise. Pretty soon, the whole thing smelled more like a burnt offering than a dinner. And there she was in the kitchen, and everything began to fall apart. And you can picture it in her head. Why is this happening to me? Why my home? Of course, Mary didn't have to ask that question for too long, Martha, because there was someone else sitting at the feet of Jesus in the other room who was easy to blame. Someone who wasn't lifting a finger to help Martha in all the work she was toiling through to put in. And as she looked around for her sister, for Mary, she glanced into the living room, and there she was sitting at the feet of Jesus. You can see Martha coming back into the kitchen. By this point, she's just as burned up as the dinner. I mean, she is so mad. I mean, it wasn't fair. Martha shouldn't have had to be doing all the work herself. I mean, where was Mary in all of this? If only that sister of hers would get back into the kitchen where she belonged and help her. And as the lesson gets further and further into what Jesus is teaching, you can just see that agitation just growing and growing and fuming. Imagine how she felt until finally feeling abandoned, not just by her sister, but probably feeling abandoned by the Lord. The storm cloud bursts. And Martha, she decides she's going to do something about it now. She doesn't tiptoe through the door into the living room. Mary, could you come over here and help me for a bit? Mary. Oh, no, that's not how it plays out. She makes a grandstand play. She storms into the living room, and she doesn't even speak to Mary. She goes right up to Jesus. And with as angry, you can just see it, as angry as she could say it, as the words become pouring out of her mouth, she says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. You read a statement like that, and I've got to admit, I really do empathize with Martha. Think about times in your life when you feel that you're doing something, and it's like, Amy's in there reading a storybook with the kids, and I'm in here just scrubbing the dishes. And halfway through the dishes, the conviction starts to pour onto your heart as you watch a mother soaking in the time with her children, and the dad's absent because a sparkling kitchen is more important than reading a story to the kids. I've been there. I know how Martha felt. And we're not trying to be hard on Martha here. I mean, after all, the Bible encourages hospitality. Romans 12:13 tells us that we are all to be given to hospitality. No, there was nothing wrong with that. 1 Peter 4:8-9 encourages all of us to, quote, have fervent love for one another and to be hospitable to one another. So you can't fault Martha or give her low marks for serving. Oh no, Martha had that one down pat. She recognized Jesus and his disciples. They had a need. They were on the road. They'd probably been traveling for quite some time. And they were hungry, naturally. And she wanted to be a good friend to them, a helper to them, and she wanted to meet their needs. That's the kind of person that Martha was. She's someone who would sit by a sick child while the child's mother got some rest. She's the person that if a family was sick, she was the one that brought the crock pot over to help feed them and take care of them while they got better. That's Martha. And that's all she's doing here. Martha wants to show her hospitality to Jesus and to his disciples. Let me tell you, if it weren't for the Marthas of this world, nothing would ever get done. Few sermons would ever get preached, Very few mission trips would ever be undertaken. If it weren't for the Marthas of the world, you could put evangelism to bed. I mean, we need Marthas. Any pastor who's got a lick of sense would be honored to have Marthas sitting in this room today. And let me tell you, if you are a Martha and you are sitting here, I want to thank you for your service. Amen. That's not the rebuke here in this passage. In fact, if you think about the story that we studied right before this one in Luke 10, you remember the parable of the compassionate Samaritan. And you remember what was the basic lesson in that story? It was that your neighbor, whoever that might be, someone who has a need, if you are in a position to meet, that is what God is calling you to do. And you realize that that's all that Martha is doing here. She's being a good neighbor. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as I think about the story of the Good Samaritan, the compassionate Samaritan, and think about the story here that follows it, Mary and Martha, I really think that God put that story right after the Good Samaritan for a reason. After all, the chronology of it doesn't line up. You realize in the Gospel of John that Bethany is actually way past Jericho, closer to Jerusalem. And Jesus has already started his onward trek up to Jerusalem. So if Jesus has stopped in Bethany, and yet he hasn't even gotten to Jericho, my point is there's a theological reason for this story to be where it is, right after the story of the compassionate Samaritan. I think that God has this story here because he wants to build on that message by reminding us of the priorities in the Christian life. You see, Martha represents the common view, where serving others is the highest good, right? And so naturally, she expects Jesus to rebuke Mary for her not helping her serve them. But I think God wants Martha, and he wants all of us to realize that while hospitality and serving others is a vital part of this walk that we have here on this earth, it's not the most important thing. It's not the most needful. And because of that, what Jesus says next, it catches her completely off guard. Look at this verse here in verse 41. As you watch Jesus taking Mary's theology, and he turns it completely upside down. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things. Imagine what's going on through her head. I mean, the meal, the visit, the house. I can just hear Jesus, so many worries, Martha. So many worries, so many troubles going on in your heart. Verse 42, but just one thing is needful. The thing that matters most, it's not hospitality. And Mary has chosen that good part, the better thing, the most important thing. And that's not going to be taken away from her. Jesus says that Mary has chosen the better thing. Well, what did Mary choose, though? I mean, you think about it, what was the one thing that was needful, the most important thing that Jesus refers to here? Well, if I can ask another question, what was it that the lawyer said? What was the greatest commandment of the Bible? Luke 10, before this story. Jesus said, what is the greatest commandment of all? Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And what was the second commandment? Leviticus 18, it was love your neighbor as yourself. Now you remember, the first commandment was about God, and the second commandment was about the neighbor. And they're always in that order, if you think about it. God first, and then our neighbor. And before you and I can ever become involved in serving others, Jesus Christ has to come first. And you find in other places that he has to serve you. Remember in John, if I wash you not, you have no part with me. And Mary chose the good part. Because for her, it wasn't so much what she could do for the Lord. As one writer of this text said, a ministry to our spirit must precede a ministry to others. And Mary understood that. So as she sat at Jesus' feet, she listened, she gleaned his word. And she allowed him to minister to her. She knew that he had all that she needed. Before she could ever dream of doing anything for him, she'd have to be at his feet, feasting at his word. You know, that's the lesson we learned from Mary this morning. It's that the most important thing, the thing that's most needful in all of our lives, it's recognizing that it's not all about what I can accomplish for him or what you can do for the Lord, but what Jesus can do for you. You know, some of us need to underline that lesson in our life, and I'm one of them. Because as good as it is to serve others and to be hospitable, it's so easy to become distracted and forget what's really important. And that's the Lord, and that's our relationship with him. The highest good indeed is sitting at his feet and learning eternal truths. Heaven's becomes the priority over the earthly. The passage becomes a rebuke, doesn't it, to churches who place a low priority on the Word of God, churches that would put other things, programs, and all that before the ministry of the Word. Ministry of the Word always has the upper place in any list of our church's ambitions and our goals. And friend, when you do that, when you put the ministry of the Word above everything else, God promises you in this story, when you put his Word and him on the pedestal where it belongs, where it should be, that is the best thing you can do. And God promises to never take that blessing away. With that, I want to encourage all of us this morning here that God doesn't need us. He doesn't depend on us. It's not about what you can do for him in your life. It's all about what he can do for us. You know, that truth, it transformed the life of a blind man in Luke 18. In fact, I'd like to leave you with a question. The question that Jesus asked blind Bartimaeus in Luke 18:41. It's the question he asks all of us every day of our life. And the question is this: as blind Bartimaeus blindly looked for Jesus, and he finds him, Jesus, looking down at the blind man, he says, "What do you want me to do for you? We were down here praying earlier, and I was thinking this morning as I was meditating and praying over this passage that, you have not because you ask not. And that's not the case with us this morning. But a lot of times, the reason we don't have is because we've never asked. We're too busy trying to get what we want. But why not instead strive to be a Mary in a Martha world?